Hi there, everyone. Welcome to part one of the Making Continuous Feedback Happen in 2020 webinar series. I'm Casey.
I'm Hilary.
And we're really excited to get started with you guys today. We've really put a lot of thought into making what we hope to be a really relevant deck for you. We've basically collected a lot of the questions and answers, of course, from recent client conversations, and also some conferences that Hilary in particular has been visiting in the recent days. So we hope this is a really helpful presentation for you all. So let's get started. We're going to head over to slide 1. So to set the stage here, we have here a brief lineup of the most well-known methods for collecting feedback. The two on the left are the most popular, right? So we have the annual and the pulse surveys. And those two have been around for decades. The annuals actually started back in the 50s, and the pulses really came out around the mid-80s, late 90s kind of situation. So everybody's pretty familiar with those. I know that Hilary and I both came from a company where we had annuals and a few intermittent pulse surveys throughout the year. But really what's come to the forefront as the best way to engage with your employees is the continuous feedback system.
Yeah, and continuous, we call it evergreen also because it's always fresh. It's ongoing, it's a living, breathing process to collect data points from your frontline employees all the way up to the chairman. So the point of continuous feedback is not just to collect the information, but to give it back and to return it into the workforce.
That's right. And also, in addition to that, it's this feeling of time. So with annuals, of course, you're thinking once, maybe twice a year, you're gathering this feedback from your employees. With Pulse, it's very event-centric as well, because you're maybe focused on a topic. Maybe you rolled out a brand new initiative, or maybe your company has an overall strategy that's brand new for the year. And so both of those are either focused on a specific event, it's just time to do the annual because that's how we've always done it, or it's time for a pulse because we don't know how you guys feel about the new policy. So continuous is this aspect of all the time. You're always able to check in with your employees. So what is continuous employee feedback? Simply put, it's a continuous feedback strategy that encourages consistent communication centered around an employee's growth. It leverages the trial and error learning patterns that are central to the ways we naturally learn. So, thinking back to when you were a kid, we're constantly receiving these external, trial and error signals, right? Your mom's telling you, don't touch that. Your friends are telling you, oh, we need to do this, not that. It's a constant trial and error that we use to this day. So learning in a continuous manner is very familiar to us. It's what we're used to doing.
Yeah, and I spoke with a lot of leaders recently that felt like annual reviews, even when accompanied by pulse surveys, were a necessary evil as opposed to something that was really productive and something that they felt they got a lot of return from. So many understood the need to transition to a continuous feedback culture. However, they felt that maybe it was unachievable or too heavy of a lift or maybe too severe of a strategic turn for a lot of people in their organization.
That's right. I think that can be really felt by a lot of us when we're trying something new, right? Especially in a complete paradigm shift, like moving from pulses and annuals, which again have been around for decades, to kind of the new kid on the block, which is continuous, even if the latter is more effective and useful. So we're going to talk about that a little bit because what I think you'll find is that continuous feedback is much more lightweight and approachable than the past two approaches have been. So hopefully you'll be pleasantly surprised. Why choose a continuous feedback approach? Going back again to this idea of event-centric versus evergreen, annuals and pulses, these very event-centric approaches, they're annual, biannual, or pulse, of course, but they're dreaded by employees. They're dreaded by employees, which leads to low participation rates. They interrupt business momentum, which think about these industries like retail environment, you can't just pull your salespeople off the floor for several hours at a time to get this annual read from them. At least in my previous company, it would take me hours to write up my own personal review, then those of my direct reports, and then those of my managers. And I did know some people who would just take the day off completely to make sure that they could focus and do what needed doing. Because in the end, even though it was such a pain, it was this thing that ate up our time. It pushed all of our to-do lists, for our actual job backwards. We still understood how important it was for my own career progression. I cared about my manager's progression. I certainly cared about developing my direct reports. So, it can really interrupt that momentum for all of those reasons. Looking at the continuous approach, so this is really more future facing, right? It's more sustainable for several reasons that we're going to be covering, but entering into a continuous process is really helpful for several reasons. Number one is when it's continuous, it's not so scary. It's not rare. It's not this thing where, oh, you have to remember how we did this in the past, what really worked last time I gave feedback, what's going to help this next time. It tends to encourage higher participation because it's lighter weight. It's a natural part of everyone's workflow. It's just like signing into my workstation every day. I just give feedback. It's not this extra thing that I feel I have to do suddenly. But it also gives talent leaders and executives insight into whether their company and their workforce is really ready for next month's new initiative or next year's new strategy. So it's really helpful from a, again, overall time period standpoint.
So the reason why your participation rate is so low is you have to consider the emotional and cognitive load required of annual and pulse surveys. And I think Casey can really expand upon this.
Right. So number one, this is not my favorite slide in the deck, but it is an important one because we want to dig deeper into the reason why your participation rate is so low. And the number one reason is anxiety. So we're going to talk about anxiety, but also all of the things that feed into it. So number one, the pre and post communication. And we're really thinking about this from the HR manager standpoint. So I'm sure that as the annual or biannual review approaches, you're sending out emails. Maybe you send out the one, 6 weeks prior to let everyone know, hey, it's coming soon, start being prepared. Here's the training on it. Here's the link to it, so on and so forth. And then maybe you partner with one of your other stakeholders in a different department so that your employees can hear it from somebody else. So there's a lot of anxiety building, even from the HR department standpoint of, okay, here it comes. Now I've got to start sending out all these emails. The time required, we kind of went over this in a previous slide, but thinking about all the time that's required, for a lot of people, it can take several hours, which again, just pauses all the business momentum for the company. The rarity. So thinking about, again, this isn't something that I'm used to doing. It's not on my everyday task list or even my weekly task list most of the time. It's something that is rare, which means there's just going to be anxiety naturally connected to something like that. Impact. So like we just said, impact on my career, impact on my manager's career, impact on my direct reports career. There's so much emotional connection tied to this process that again, it kind of feeds into the anxiety because you want to do well by them. You want to do well by the people who are, you work with every day.
I remember feeling like annual reviews were 52 weeks of Sunday scaries balled up into one day. And the anxiety and, fear for my performance reviews was palpable.
Right. And, taking notes, when I was a manager and had these direct reports, taking notes throughout the year in one Word document and just, they did this, they struggled with this, but now they're doing better. Trying to remember everything, which leads into that memory decay. You want to make sure that you're remembering all the great work that everybody has done over the past year, but you also want to remember with clarity where they struggled. And if they came out of it, that's awesome. You want to be able to speak specifically to it. If they didn't, then you need to create a developmental plan for them as part of the annual review. So again, some anxiety there. And then subjectivity. And these last couple of ones, the subjectivity, backlog of my to-do list, these are kind of where the anxiety starts getting really heavy for the employees, because they realize that it's all subjective anyway. Maybe they don't have a great relationship with the manager. Maybe they don't, they can't trust that the manager is remembering all of their great accomplishments over the past year. And then also their own to-do list is getting shoved to the side. And especially, well, not especially, but if you have clients and their work is being pushed to the side, then you have several factors, weighing in on you there. Remembering to do it in the first place. I have to log in, I have to go find that platform, I have to remember how to do all this after a year. But finally, it's this idea of what's in it for me. And this is really something that I've seen a lot on articles. I think you were talking about it at one of the conferences, but it's this idea of HR folks agreeing that you shouldn't really ask for feedback until you're ready to act on it. So, asking your employees to send in all these answers to these questions, but then imagining that they're not even going to receive answers or next steps for 3, maybe 6 months, where they receive just the general digest of what everybody sent in, it can really start being like, why am I doing this? Why should I bother even spending 15 minutes on this thing? And that's where you get those low participation rates. All of those come in together and boom, you've got anxiety leads to low participation in the first place. And that's where we really don't want to be, which is where HR is then pressured to, we talk about it a lot here at Rabbit. I'm not sure if the participants feel this way also. But then because of this low engagement, HR gets pushed into this, this bribe situation where then you're getting the emails of, hey, if we reach 80% participation, we'll throw a pizza party, and nobody wants to send that email.
Right. And it's funny because to me, that signals that people actually at the very core do care. They want to be heard, they want to participate, and they want to be involved, but they feel like they're not being heard. And, when we're not getting what we need, we behave in ways that we may not than when we're getting our needs met. And that does come through in the employee experience as well. When their needs are not being met, when we're not providing with the right amount of feedback, when we're not giving them the right development or identifying their skills gap so they can professionally develop and grow, then they're going to be actively disengaged. And that's what we're starting to see is we're getting to the root problem of it. And what are the behaviors that really lead back to some of, we're all adults, so it's not necessarily misbehaving, but lead to these patterns of disengagement.
That's right. So let's try and get away from this. So continuous feedback really helps everybody getting back into this track. And we'll start off with the individual contributors.
Yeah, I mean, individual contributors, let me go back to this because this is something that I get all fired up about. Individual contributors really, most of the time, care about their individual success, but don't know how to measure where they stand. So when you're able to give them continuous feedback throughout their employee life cycle, then they can take their own opportunities, create their own action plans, become empowered, and go to their leaders. And not all leaders are strong enough to be introspective and to understand what their people know. With continuous feedback, you're now giving people the opportunity to take control of it themselves.
It puts it in their own hands, which leads directly, of course, into how we can improve the manager experience. So thinking back again to the employee life cycle, the employee experience, which is really becoming this buzzword in the industry. Managers, when they have a new person on board, that new onboarding person, that new little baby teammate needs a lot of help, right? They need a lot of one-on-one. They crave knowing how they're doing in this brand new company. Whether you're starting out your career for the very first time or you have 40 years of experience, if you move into a new place, you want to know how you're doing early on. But managers really don't have time to do all of the hand-holding and scheduling one-on-ones around all of the onboarding sessions that are in place. So continuous feedback is just one way that it can feed directly into that life cycle, give the employees what they need, and also give the managers what they need, which is knowing how their employee is doing.
Speaking of training, we're in Pittsburgh and have a train going by.
You might hear that train rolling by. So yeah, let's keep going a little bit here.
And another thing is that it really peels back the veil that we have and allows for HR leaders to identify their high potentials, to find talent and development opportunities, to react faster. Because when you have these gaps of year over year, then you have this absent space that things may not be getting done. And then on the inverse of that, it's very difficult to measure and gauge objectively the fruit of your talent development programs, whether or not sending your executive leaders to a specific and most of the time very expensive type of training program, or even retraining your frontline with upcoming AI or whatever that might be. It's very difficult to measure the ROI on the outcomes unless you have a model in place to measure that.
Right, that's exactly right. And then finally, wrapping it up, is the visibility that operations has to better understand whether their workforce is aligned to company values and to achieve the new strategic priorities. So it really goes hand in hand with everybody. And the real champion of continuous feedback is that it gives individuals data, it gives managers data, it gives HR data, and it gives operations data. So everybody has something from the approach. Everybody gets something from it.
Yeah.
Oh, so we're going to quickly recap the answers from the poll here. And the question was, how frequently does your company collect feedback? And it looks like it was annual.
Yeah. Not surprised.
Not surprised at all. That's what I came from. That's what you came from. So not surprised to hear. And this is where we just wanted to quickly recap what we've just talked about, the differences and comparisons between the three. But finally, remembering to layer in that idea of anxiety. I would say annual has a really high level anxiety related to it. Pulse is more medium. Usually Pulse takes maybe 10 to 15 minutes per survey. You know, we're thinking of the kinds of Pulse surveys that have a written element to it, so that can take a little bit more time. But then continuous is much lower. And really the baseline for that is because it's familiar, it's frequent, and it's lightweight. So there's not all this anxiety and cognitive and emotional load required of it.
One of the benefits too about this continuous function, and I met a lot of internal comms people, specifically at last week's convention, that only have one annual touch point. They have one piece of data to be able to tell the story of the organization to many different people, and within many different ethnicities as well. We're talking not just in the United States, but all over the world.
Right.
And without these different touch points throughout their organization, throughout the world, they can't get necessarily the buy-in from, let's say, the CEO who's concerned about EBITDA versus the COO who may be concerned about whether or not morale is high and that we're retaining people, or you know, whether or not there's low workplace safety incidents on, you know, in the production floors.
Right, right. So yeah, storytelling, I mean, would you rather have one piece of data or multiple pieces of data when you needed to go tell a story to somebody? So that makes a lot of sense. And speaking of favorite stories.
When I started with Rabbit, I decided I'm going to look into HR leaders and I'm going to understand who they are, what makes them tick, because I knew what my priorities were as a former leader, but I just want to know who the people in the industry were. And Dean Carter probably is not someone that you don't know. I feel like he is everywhere, but he's a CHRO at Patagonia. And the reason why I chose Dean is not just because I do align my cultural values with Patagonia, but he sees the necessity of doing the same for his executives all the way down to the people in the workforce. That one of the most important measurements to him is whether or not they're expressing their cultural values, and then everything else falls into place. And what he did, he went from Sears and Roebuck, which was at the time a 90,000 person company, was using continuous feedback there, went to the CEO of Patagonia and said, hey, look, this is what we've been doing there. I'd like to do it here. The CEO didn't quite see the value at that time. They said, we're a 2,000 person company. We're already very close now. We don't need this.
And this was back in 2012, I think. So,
2015.
you know, it was several years ago, you know, not, maybe it wasn't as well known as it is now, continuous feedback at least.
Yeah, ahead of the curve. So what he did is what, you know, most really strong HR professionals did is he developed a business case. He put together some white papers. He went back to his CEO and said, here's the evidence. Trust me, if it doesn't work, you can let me go. Yeah. And I mean, what a story.
Yeah.
Which is why that resonated with me, not only as a data person, but somebody who respects a strong business case. And one of the metrics that I love that comes out of there is they have 100% return rate for maternity leave.
Yeah, and that's incredible. As a mother of two, I can really relate to that aspect. But what I think our clients can relate to is this idea of measuring executives.
Mm-hmm.
That can be a real, a challenge. Emotions can fly. Executives don't always want to hear what they're doing wrong, what they're doing, maybe that they need to change. So we know that can be kind of a struggle for HR leaders to get across to them.
Servant leadership is kind of a new thing.
Right. That's right. So we're going to move into our last couple of slides here. What are the hallmarks of a good continuous feedback program? One, again, lightweight, unobtrusive. It has to be lightweight. If it's not lightweight, if it's intrusive, it gets in the way of my everyday life, I'm not going to want to deal with it. It's just that easy. As an individual, I'm not going to want to log in. I'm going to be, cranky with the rest of my teammates about having to do this thing. It needs to have objective and meaningful data. This does go back to the user. It's always going to go back to the user, because if I know that my manager is submitting written feedback, maybe this person has more leverage than I do, being younger in the company, but she's being very subjective, that can give me a little bit of uneasiness. So making sure that it's objective, it measures observable behaviors. These are the kinds of things that you want in your continuous feedback program. And then finally, being championed at the C level. This goes back to what you were saying about Dean Carter. It also goes back to what we're saying about it can't be a secondary role. It needs to be championed from the top down.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I've experienced implementations that went completely sideways because the CEO just didn't believe it. And after I was hired to put a CRM process into place, we ended up just wasting $80,000 a year. Yeah, and a Burson article came out this morning that supports that. I'll send it to everybody that's on the webinar today, because it was a really great read, and it was very validating.
Oh, so. That's right. I heard you, exclaiming after reading that article. So I want to hear more about that. Yeah. So really wrapping it up here, how to capture continuous feedback. And what we wanted to do here was we distilled a lot of the conversations that we've been having with our clients, that Hilary's been having at different conferences, and we wanted to list them here. So when you don't know which questions to ask, we kind of wanted to jot some down for you to get you started. So number one, how frictive is the feedback capture process going to be? Some ideas around this would be, does the person have to log in? Does the person have to remember to refresh their password every 90 days? Is it a tokenized situation where they receive a link, they don't have to think about it, they click the link and they're in, there's no passwords required? Is it lightweight? Is it unobtrusive? Again, so is it something where they're going to have to spend an hour doing it once a month, once a week, something like that? Or is it lightweight enough that I know I can be done with this thing in a few seconds, but HR still gets what they need?
Yeah. Who benefits from it? Again, what's in it for me? You can build a really solid business case around it by determining if it's the individuals or if it's the leadership, or if you can unify it where it becomes a scenario where everybody benefits from it. You've got an airtight business case.
That's right. The what's in it for me is answered. Can the process be tailored to our company's unique competencies? So just like what you were saying, your previous company had spent $80,000 on this program. We know that a lot of clients spend a lot of money investing in the build of a new competency model. Mm-hmm. So understanding which behaviors is going to lead to their success. And then they often, of course, they want to keep that messaging consistent, whether it's their next learning and development workshop where they focus on those unique competencies and building them, or it's, this new continuous feedback model. Can the program be tailored?
Does the platform provide reporting and analytics at the granularity needed by the team and leadership? Are you really going to get the data that you need to support the outcome of your program? Do you have reporting on the back end? Are you going to be able to tell those stories? Like, you need to be able to back it up with that data. And are you going to be able to have that as an endpoint?
Yeah, that's right. And then that moves into, is the platform a standalone SaaS product? Do you buy it and then they leave you? Or do they have a consulting arm that can help you digest that data and tell that story?
Yeah.
And these final two we're not going to go over, but we're thinking about some of the other stakeholders in your conversations. Your CTO is going to want to know about the platform security protocols, and your other HR folks are going to want to know whether it can integrate with the HRIS system that you're using. So here, thinking about what's next for you, and you might be in the learn section, you might be actively comparing platforms, or you might be ready to do. So we wanted to give you a little bit of everything. So for learning, if you're still learning about continuous feedback, join us for part 2. It's coming up on Monday, December 9th, and more will come out on that. And Hilary's starting up a book club.
Yeah, I'm actually building out a cohort of people depending on their verticals, skills, to bring people with really diverse skill sets together, and then share our own opinions about different books that we'll be reading at the same time. So I wanted to buck the traditional book club model because I wanted to bring some really unique individuals together to trade their own best practices and stories, and make it a more interesting experiment, if you will. It's like we're all scientists.
You don't
here.
want to increase engagement, do you?
Weird, yeah.
So yeah, and then if you want to compare platforms, here's some information for you. And then if you're ready to do it, send us an email. We'd be happy to talk to you for 10 or 15 minutes. So let's head into some Q&A. Does anybody have any questions here? I know we're right at time.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. All right, and it looks like we have one question about competency models. So if our competency model is outdated, then how do we get buy-in for updating the program and then moving to continuous feedback?
That's a tough one. That's something that Jocelyn and Alexander would be good ones to speak to. I would say, why is your competency model outdated in the first place? Do we need to refresh it? Do we need to revisit? And then, you know, it depends on the platform, how you're going to build a new program around it. So that's a little dependent on which platform you decide on going. But if you end up moving forward with Rabbit, that's something that usually Hilary or Jocelyn and Alexander would help you build out.
Yeah. Let's see, it looks like we're right at 30. So if there are any other questions, please send them to hello@rabbit, RHABIT, that's rhabit.co. We'll be happy to answer them individually, and then look out for a response email because we're going to send you a download with all of the questions, the deck, and any other information you might need from this session. So
that's right. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great week.
Good to see you guys.